Hi there folks, in today's demonstration it's all about Power Automate but a little bit of logic apps. We're going to have a look at Azure App Registrations, their client secrets and their expiry dates. How can we automatically get those expiry dates into a usable data source without complex apply to each actions? So fortunately we have a Graph API. We're going to be doing a bit of Azure and we're going to be turning this complex data structure with nested arrays into a very simple array with just the data fields that we're looking for using XML. So as usual, lots of demos throughout, lots of tips and advice and sample expressions, and of course I have a blog post on this one too, so it is a complex one, but there's plenty to learn. So if you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's jump into my demonstration. So I'm going to kick things off today in an Azure App Registration. I'm on the Certificates and Secrets tab, and I have 3 separate client secrets, one of which is already expired, another which is due to expire in the next couple of weeks, and one that's still got plenty of life in it until 2025. So how do we monitor these client secrets and their expiry dates? Well, if we jump across onto the Microsoft documentation, there is an endpoint on Graph API for applications. And so if we create an app registration, ironically, in Azure, we can then apply the necessary permissions and we can use this endpoint to retrieve a list of all the applications that we have on Azure. And then with the data that's retrieved, we can look at the expiry dates of both the client secrets but also the certificates. Jumping over onto the Graph Explorer, we can see I've already put that endpoint into the URL Explorer here, and I have selected specific fields from that endpoint. I've run the query and we've returned a value array. And within that value array, we have each of the applications. So we have my first application here, we have my second application here. And if I scroll down a bit further, we can see I have my first bot, which has all the details regarding those 3 client secrets that I had. So we can see things like the end date, the display name, the key ID, the start date, and of which I have 3 of them. So the interesting thing about this, the structure is such that the value is an array of all the applications. Within each of those applications, we have another array, which is the password credentials, which are all the details regarding our client secrets. And then there's also another array, key credentials, which return all the details regarding all the certificates. So some nested arrays here, which makes the structure complicated when it comes to retrieving data in Power Automate. But in today's demo, I'm going to show you how to potentially achieve that without any nested apply to each actions. So jumping over into Power Automate, we're now looking at the history of a flow run that's managed to retrieve all the expiry dates of my client secrets and certificates on my app registrations in Azure. You'll note that I do have a do until, and the reason for that is the applications endpoint on Graph API retrieves data back in page sizes of up to 999. I have about 40 app registrations on my Azure tenant, and I have deliberately set the page size to 10 just so we can emulate that looping. The data manipulation is done amongst these 7 actions here, so absolutely 0 nested apply to eaches in order to get all those details from those 2 arrays that we saw in the Graph Explorer. I do have an apply to each further down, and the purpose of that is to get the owners of our app registrations where the client secret is expiring in the next 30 days or so. So we're deliberately targeting the owners of those applications where the client secrets are due to expire. And ultimately this reduces the number of API calls by only running that HTTP action on the app registrations where we require to do so. So if I pop open the compose at the very end and have a look at the raw outputs, we can see that I have the app ID and also the app display name. Again, my first bot, dbird. If you remember, I had an expiring client secret. It actually expires in the next 16 days. We can see the end date, we can see the start date, and we can also see the name of the key. And that applies to all of the keys that we see here. They're all based on different application registrations, and some of them are client secrets and some of them are indeed certificates, as you can see by the type that I have defined in this array. Now for the next 60 seconds I'm going rogue. You'll notice I'm now across on Azure and I have what looks like a flow. In fact, it is a logic app, and I've built it out exactly the same way as I've just demonstrated in Power Automate. I have the HTTP trigger to get my bearer token, my couple of variables, my do until, so I can get all those pages. all of those compose and select actions so that I can get all that data and repurpose it and apply to each to get the owners, and then my final compose, which outputs exactly the same data. So the only difference here is this is a logic app, exactly the same logic. The interface looks slightly different. And if I pop open this other browser tab, you'll see I'm now in Power Automate in an interface that looks very similar. It is in fact the new designer that's coming to Power Automate in the next few months and is currently in preview. So if you're an admin of Azure and you're thinking, I don't want to do this on Power Automate, I want to do it in a logic app. Well, don't worry. This solution will work in either Power Automate, as you can see here, or in a logic app, which we can now see in the output on the right-hand side. Anyway, enough of that, let's get back to Power Automate. Next up, I'm going to explain to you how this all came together, and we've got side by side the flow and edit mode on the left, and on the right hand side we've got that flow history that will allow us to explore things in more detail. First up, I have the HTTP trigger. All I'm doing here is based on an app registration that I've created for this endpoint where I've enabled the permissions for the Graph API applications URI. I have my client ID and client secret so that I can get a bearer token. So you'll notice that my client secret, client ID are make-believe, but of course you'll need to make sure yours apply to your app registration. So with this in place, I then have a couple of variables that I've initialized. The first up is the var URI, which is just the URI that we're using for the application's endpoint. We require this as we use it in our apply to each loop. I start with a page size of 10 in this case. You can set yours to 999 or less, and this is what enables the flow to go through the do until loop and get all of the pages for the app registrations. If we look at the next variable, it's all about creating an array. So this is a response. Because we're getting the data back in pages, we need to bring together all those page responses together in one gigantic array. And whilst I'm not usually a fan of using variables unless absolutely necessary, there are these two that we definitely need. One, because of the do until, we need to make sure that we're updating that array as we loop through. The second is based on this array. We want to be able to append or create a union of the existing pages that we've added to this array and also the new page or the new array that we've retrieved from the HTTP endpoint. And we do that with a little trick using my favorite action, of course, the compose in the do until. So with those two variables initialized, we go into the do until. And the do until is looking at that var URI, which of course contains the URL. Is it empty? Is it equal to nothing? Of course, it's not in the first run because we've already set it to a URL. So we're going to call the endpoint and we're going to get all those lovely application registrations from Azure AD using our bearer token, bearer space, and then the access token. Now you can see the expression online. I've got all these in my blog post, so if you're struggling to see these, you can have a look at my blog post. It's in the description. But we're getting the access token from the HTTP call above. And then this is where the clever little trick comes in. We have a compose action. So that compose action is going to take a copy of that original array that contains all the responses to date. The first run, of course, will be empty. But what that enables us to do is when we go into the final set variable at the end here, we're creating a union. So that union, if we were try to run it on itself and the response back from the HTTP action, we'll get an error because of course we can't cross-reference, we can't reference ourselves. But because we've created a copy of that variable in our compose, we can reference that compose and we can create a union of all the responses to date with the response that comes back in the next HTTP call in this do until. So there we allow ourselves to create one gigantic array of all of the pages and don't have to worry about any mucking about with the data until outside of this do until. The set variable in the middle is all about getting that next URI link. So we have that var URI. I have a call to this OData next link. If there is a response, we'll get back a link. If there isn't, then it'll be empty. And of course, there are no more pages to retrieve. If we jump across onto the right hand side, we can have a look at the history. We can see here I'm getting the apps. I've got 4 loops in this case. So we're getting all the data. We can see there is a next link in this particular run. If I go into next again and next again and next again, we'll go right to the very end. We can see we no longer have a next link in this particular response because, of course, there are no more pages. We've got all the app registrations. If we have a look then at the compose response, this is, of course, the array of everything that we've had up until this particular run. So this will contain 3 response pages as a result of creating a union. The set variable, of course, is blank in this case. If I was to go and step back onto the 3rd run, we'll be able to have a look at that and we can see we have the next URI, which of course allows that do until to keep running. And then the set variable response is just a union, remember, of our compose action, which contains all of the pages previously based on that variable that we have, and it brings together the response that we've just got back from that HTTP action. So back over onto our flow, we can collapse that do until and we can have a look at our next action. So if you remember at this point, our var response is based on all of the pages. We've created a union. The first thing I'm doing here is to restructure that data so that we have a root, and this enables us to convert it into XML, and it's XML that we're going to exploit today so that we can get all of our key IDs out of this complex data structure. So with this in place, I can then run the compose XML, and that ultimately allows me to run this XML expression. It converts our object where we've placed the array of all of our applications into an XML format, and with that we can start using XPath. If we look over on the left hand side, what does that look like? Well, all I've done is created this new object with root and then apps, and we can see my array of all of our applications and the password credentials and key credentials. But if I pop open the XML, you can see that that format is completely changed now. We've no longer got JSON, we have got some XML to look at. Next up, we have got select the passwords from XPath. Now I've actually split up both selection of the passwords and the keys as 2 separate select actions, but they're pretty much identical. Now what I'm doing here is I have an XPath query at the top of both of them, and I'm searching the XML that I've just created based on the password credentials element, and that then lets me go and get all of the key IDs from that data. Now probably the best way to see all this is actually to copy the XML into a tool like XPather and run this particular expression, which I'll go and do now. So if I pop open my compose XML, I can Control A, Control C, and if I jump into XPather, Control A, Control V, that gets all my XML. I can format it, and if I paste in that expression that I'm using in Power Automate, we can see on the right hand side now that I have all of the key IDs for my password credentials, and as I scroll down we can see those highlighted. So where there are nested objects or nested elements for the password credentials, I'm retrieving all of those key IDs. Again, looking at my first bot, we've got 1, 2 and 3. They've all been highlighted, they've all been selected using this one XML query. Now because we have those key IDs, we can do lots of other clever things as well. Now that we've got those key IDs, we can have a look at the root app ID. So it's very easy for me to get that root app ID based on these individual key IDs. And that's ultimately what I do in the rest of the select, is I build out expressions in XML that enable me to target the different elements and retrieve things like the display name, the end date and the start date based on the key ID, but then also get the parent information, including the app ID and the ID and also the display name of that app. And so it doesn't really matter now if we've got key IDs in the same password credentials structure. So jumping back into Power Automate, what I have here on the left hand side is my select that's getting, of course, all the key IDs for the password credentials array. I also have a select here that's getting all the key IDs for the key credentials array. So you'll see slight differences there in the expressions. Then what I'm doing is I'm retrieving that key ID, which is based on item. A simple expression there, item with open close brackets. That retrieves the key ID from this array that we've created above. And then all I'm doing for these other items is creating XPath expressions. So you'll see I have very similar expressions as I do in this opening XPath query where I'm getting the key ID. I'm querying the password credentials where the key ID is equal to the key ID that we've retrieved in the array above, and then I'm getting the display name or the start date, the end date, the app ID, etc. So I'm using XPath with the key ID, which is retrieved from this array expression above, to then create XPath queries. I'm not getting the data from the XML at this point. I'm simply using the select to create the XPath queries. And you'll see if we look over on the right hand side, if I pop open the output, that's exactly what I'm doing. I have the key ID in our new array structure, and then for each of these values, all I have done at this point is to create an expression in XPath that will allow me to retrieve the display name based on that key ID for each of these objects that we're creating. Because basically in the next select, we're going to use these XPath expressions to then retrieve the data from the XML. Why did I do it this way? I felt it was cleaner for the sake of 2 additional select actions for both the password credentials and the key credentials. It was a lot easier and a lot cleaner to see these expressions being built up in a separate select action. So with both of these explained, if you want more detail, you can have a look at my blog post. Next up, we're going to have a look at actually selecting those password keys from the apps with the dates, and that's exactly what this next select action does. So I have a union, and that union is bringing together both of those select actions above, because now we can select all of our key IDs from both of those 2 structures, the one that's the password, which is the client secrets, and the one which is the keys, which is our certificates. And then using the key ID, we now start referencing these based on the structure that we've created. So you'll see it's item key ID. I can then get the display name. And again, all I'm doing is calling the XPath on the XML that's been created in the compose XML. I have the item, open close brackets, with the key display name in this case, or in the next case, it's based on the start date time. These are all based on the values that I've created in the select above. All I'm doing is retrieving these expressions that we've created in the select above. Now, the reason it's wrapped in first is because the result from XPath is an array. So even though there's only one key display name based on the XML that we've created, we need to still retrieve that first, or we will get an array in our return result here. And the same applies across the board here. The type is based on something I didn't actually explain. For each of these, I've put a type certificate here, and in the password one, I've put client secret. So it's just a fixed string, just so we're able to easily identify, is this a client secret or is this a certificate? So over on the right hand side in the history, if we pop open the raw outputs, we can now see that we've obtained the keys, the display names, start and end dates, the app ID, the app display name, also the ID as well, the ID of the app, but also the app ID of the app. We need both of them because it's actually the ID that we use in order to get the owner, and you can see the fixed client secret, or if I scroll a bit further down, maybe I'll be able to find a certificate. Yeah, so we've got some certificate examples as well there. So this is based on all my app registrations, all of the expiry dates, whether they're in the future or in the past, which will lead us nicely on to my next action, which is another select. Now in this, I have an add property, and I'm using that add property in order to calculate the date difference between today's date and the end date in our new array that we've created above. Now again, I could have done this all part of the original array in the select password keys from apps with dates, but it's a lot easier just having this as a separate step. And what I'm doing is I'm using the date difference in order to work out the number of days until our client secret or certificate expires. And the benefit of having that in our array now is we've taken our array with all the various key details. And if we look at the history over on the right hand side, we'll have a new property looking at the outputs called date difference. So we can now see how long it is until a particular client secret expires. So this one here is 15th of January 2025. That is 501 days away. Whereas we've got an example here, which is the 18th of September, and that expires in 16 days. So with that in place, it sets us up nicely for our filter array over on the left. Again, in the edit, we have the advanced mode, 2 queries with an and. Is it less than or equal to 30, or is it greater than or equal to -7? So i.e., is it due to expire in the next 30 days, or has it already expired in the last 7 days? And that will then allow us to target specific app registrations with client or certificate expiry dates that are in that date range and present that to our apply to each. If I have a look at that filter array, you can see that I start with a massive array of data, but then I get quite a small array of data. We've only got maybe about 7 or so in our output here, 7 or 8 that are due to expire. So that apply to each is another HTTP call. We're going through that filter array. We're passing on the ID. The expression is based on item apply to each and then the name of that key, in which case I have called it ID. As we can see there, that was defined in the select further up. We pass on that same access token with bearer space, of course, and that allows us to get our owners. If we look at the compose owners, all I'm doing again is using that add property to add, in this case slightly different, rather than to a select, I'm doing it to an individual object. And that object is based on items apply to each, which will get an object for each of the loops, which is each of the applications. I'm adding in a property called owner, and then I'm retrieving the first email that comes back. What does that look like on the history? Well, over on the right hand side, we can pop that open. We can see that I've actually got 8 different app registrations with client secrets that are due to expire in the next 30 odd days. We have an HTTP call to get all the various details, and we have a look at that raw output. We can see it's actually me that owns that particular registration. And then if we pop open the compose, we can see that we have the object of that particular application. And in there now I have hopefully an owner, so we can see the email address for the owner of this app registration. So because this is an object, it's in a compose, our final step outside of that apply to each is to use this clever little trick, outputs with the name of that compose, in this case compose owners, and it will bring together all of those objects in that apply to each back into an array. If I pop that open on the history, we can have a look at the output, and we can see now that I have a lovely array with all those various details about the application, about the key, about the date difference, and who the owner is for each of those 8 future expiring client secrets or certificates that are based on different app registrations on Azure. Thanks very much for getting to this point. We've learned how to use Power Automate, potentially Logic Apps, to query Graph API for those app registration expiry dates. And even though it's a very complex data structure, turn it into a very meaningful data structure using some techniques other than horrible nested apply to each actions. So I'd love to hear in the comments below what you've learned, what you're going to do different next time. And of course, make sure you like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thanks for watching. Cheers.